Hello and welcome to Forever Motorsports. The cold conditions expected when the cars take to the track on Thursday evening in Las Vegas are set to provide Formula One teams with an intriguing challenge. This weekend is predicted to be possibly the coldest Grand Prix since the Canadian Grand Prix in 1978, with temperatures for the race ranging from 5 degrees to 10 degrees Celsius. Before we get into the video today, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel so that you can get notified with all of the latest Formula One news. With potentially the coldest race Formula One has ever seen being hosted on Sunday, teams will need to ensure that they can get the three Pirelli compounds to work effectively. But the unusually low temperatures will also have a significant impact on overall car cooling, and hence the aero specifications that the teams will be running. As such, the challenge is very different from that in recent races in Qatar and Mexico City. Compared to the latter, where the thin air requires maximum cooling, Vegas will be at the opposite extreme. And while it is obvious that modern hybrid V6 power units don't like running in too hot conditions, equally they are not designed to operate in extreme cold. While Formula One cars run in chilly winter testing and filming days in Europe, the difference is that Vegas is a competitive event, which means that there can be no compromises in terms of power unit usage. The ultra-long main straight that runs along the strip will present its own challenges. Much like Baku, it will ensure that the brakes and tyres will be potentially colder than optimum when the cars reach the corner at the end of it. Just to add to the fun though, as with any street circuit, there's only so much detail that the teams have been able to incorporate into their simulations, in terms of bumps and the exact nature of the newly laid surface, which remains something of an unknown. It is tough, said Williams head of vehicle performance, Dave Robson. I think that the combination of the track surface, which we know very little about, and how that will interact with the tyres will dictate so much of how the weekend plans out. In terms of the layout of the track, we've got a good understanding of that, and we can run it in the simulator and get a rough idea. Going to a new track like that, one of the main things will be that we go with a clear starting position. But we also have a whole host of options lined up, ready to cover whatever actually happens. Certainly we can't predict exactly how the car will behave in Vegas, so we will go there with plenty of options. Other teams agree that it is something of a step into the unknown. It does look like it's going to be cold, said Alpine head of trackside engineering, Kyron Pilbeam. We don't really know how cold it's going to get. It's a new circuit, which is always interesting. We will do our usual pre-event simulation work and simulator work, but we never quite know what you're going to get. There's always some variations in how bumpy it is, or what track surface is like. That kind of thing. We'll do everything we can before the event, but we can't do everything. We need to go in there prepared to learn in the first couple of practice sessions. Tyre management has been one of the keys to the 2023 season, and as recently as the Brazilian Grand Prix, we saw huge discrepancies between the teams that got it right for the race, notably Red Bull and Aston Martin, and those that got it wrong, such as Mercedes. Teams usually have a narrow operating window in which they can get the tyres to work, and finding that sweet spot in Vegas, with mechanical setup and outlap preparations, among other variables, might not be so straightforward. Firing them up after safety car periods will also be a special challenge with the cold conditions. In terms of the tyres, it rarely is taking them into a different environment, said Red Bull chief engineer Paul Monaghan. A few years ago, we went to the Nürburgring in October, and it was wet and cold every day. And Austin a few years ago, I remember one day was particularly freezing cold. We get into all the concerns of cold cracking, handling the tyres, all this type of thing. And yes, they are very much at the lower end of their operating range. So within the sort of freedoms that we have, with the wheel bodywork, as we now call it, and trying to operate the car, it is up to us to try and get the tyres to a point where they can work. And the challenge is there for all of us. I think that's across all three compounds. They're all going to be too cold. It's really a case of can we get all of them into the window for long enough that we can run a decent race stint. As Monaghan indicates, there's a relationship between tyres and aero specifications in terms of what he defines as the wheel bodywork, brake ducts and other parts in that area. But obviously the conditions will have a substantial impact on all other areas of the car. For Qatar and or Mexico, most teams brought extra louvres, or opened up the Coke bottle at the rear of the car to aid with cooling. You would think that would encourage teams to focus on low drag for better straight line speed, but it is not necessarily that straightforward. It's not really an error gain, it is more about managing the power unit and the gearbox and keeping all of those other things in their operating window. There's Alpine trackside engineer Kyron Pilbeam. But we are ready for that. It could be like winter testing, it could be that cold. It's hard to know exactly what we're going to find when we get there. There's times in winter testing when you need to blank out the radiators a bit, which you wouldn't normally design for your car. It could be those kind of conditions, but I think we're ready for it. The operating window is much wider than it used to be, covering between that sort of temperature. And what we saw in Qatar, it is a very wide operating temperature range. Monaghan agrees that teams should be able to adjust to what is required. I'm not too worried about sorting the car cooling out, to be honest, he said. I don't think it will be that bad. We ran our first promotional day back in February this year, and I was sitting there shivering at Silverstone, wishing I wasn't there, and we could still make it run. We'll see some more closed up cars. Maybe some people will alter the cooling exits towards the back at the top body, which will shrink it down a little bit. Teams will have to juggle the complex relationship between cooling and downforce levels. Previously, we'd have probably made a new small cooling package and traded in the cooling we didn't need for downforce, and there may have been a few other things on the car that we would have done. But now we've got to say, well, is it worth doing that? Particularly as you get towards the end of the season. That may depend on how much attrition and expense you'd had to spend in the previous months. I think it's quite a good example of how in a cost cap world do you choose to optimize the package for that particular weekend, because the parts you could make, you probably won't use anywhere else. And in part, that depends on what you think the other guys will do. So the whole thing becomes quite a nice little game theory problem. We're certainly looking forward to the Las Vegas Grand Prix weekend, and it will be very interesting to see which teams are able to get their setups into the right window in the cold and tricky conditions. Be sure to let us know in the comment section what you think of these cold conditions that are predicted for the Las Vegas Grand Prix, and be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I've been Reece on Forever Motorsports. Cheers.